Indeed, they say that when we argue for removing weapons of war from the streets of America, we're actually telling them to repeal the Second Amendment. Mr. Chairman, we are not telling them to repeal the Second Amendment. We are telling them to read the Second Amendment. That's not constitutional law. That's a constitutional joke. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman. We start with the proposition that this bloodbath is unacceptable, and we have an overriding duty as guardians of the common defense and public tranquility to end it. But our colleagues accept these deaths as the necessary and perfectly ordinary run-of-the-mill price of what they say the Constitution demands. The victims in Buffalo, Uvalde, Highland Park, Parkland, Las Vegas, Charleston, and on, are just an inescapable human sacrifice to other people's absolute constitutional right to carry whatever guns they want, wherever they want, for whatever purpose. And they invite us to believe that this macabre mass human sacrifice was undertaken deliberately by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison for the American people. So when we say we must act to save our people, they say there's nothing that can be done under the Constitution. Indeed, they say that when we argue for removing weapons of war from the streets of America, we're actually telling them to repeal the Second Amendment. Mr. Chairman, we are not telling them to repeal the Second Amendment. We are telling them to read the Second Amendment. How is it in common use for Americans to use AR-15 when 68% of Americans don't own any gun at all, and probably 80 or 85% of Americans don't own assault weapons? How is that common use when your argument is that you base it on the militia, and that's everybody who's an able-bodied person? I'm not going to yield, but I'm coming to you right now. My friend from Texas, Mr. Roy, advances the so-called insurrectionist view of the Second Amendment, that the Second Amendment's purpose is to give the people the right to overthrow or fight our government or fight the police or threaten armed resistance if the government is somehow being unfair or unjust. This reading is totally, absolutely absurd and flies in the face of the plain text of the Constitution, which in at least 5 different places clearly forbids armed violent resistance to the government. The Republican Guarantee Clause in Article 4, Section 4 provides that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or the executive against domestic violence. This was put in the Constitution specifically in response to Shays' Rebellion and armed resistance to the government of the United States, which the founders strongly opposed. Here's another provision the gentleman from Texas should consider before cavalierly suggesting in public that citizens somehow have a constitutional right to use arms against our government and our police. Article 3, Section 3, Clause 1 states, in the only constitutional passage that defines a crime, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Armed insurrection and violence against the United States is plainly making war against our government and thus is an act of treason. And I could cite all of the other ones. And what do they have against this? A quote from Patrick Henry, an anti-federalist who opposed the Constitution precisely because he thought it gave too much power to the federal government and didn't endow the people with a right of violent resistance against the government of the United States. That's not constitutional law. That's a constitutional joke. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.